2003 through 2009 Nissan Quest front wheel bearing replacement. I'm Brian Nessa from How To Automotive. I'm going to walk you through the steps of replacing the front wheel bearings. The first step is to get your vehicle off the ground and remove the wheel. The first thing we need to do is remove the brake caliper. We're going to do this as a whole assembly by removing the 19mm bolt here. And there's going to be one a little lower right down here that we're going to remove. So you're going to remove these two 19mm bolts. To remove those, I'm going to use the Milwaukee M18 mid-torque impact gun here. It's a 1/2-inch drive with a 19mm socket. As you can see, it makes quick work of removing these two bolts. So once I got the caliper off, I used a bungee cord to hold it up so it's not hanging from the brake hose. And then I went ahead and removed the rotor. You need to remove the axle nut, so you need to remove the cotter pin here. And I just used a pair of side cutters to do that. Once again, I'm going to use my Milwaukee impact gun with a 32mm socket to remove the axle nut. I will link this impact gun up in the description of the video. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the ABS sensor here. It's only held on with one 10mm bolt here. So I'm going to remove that bolt and pull the sensor out and just kind of hang it over here off the side. That way it doesn't get damaged while we change out the bearing. Next, I'm going to push the axle shaft inwards as far as I possibly can. If you can't get it to move, you can put the axle nut back on and hit it with a hammer and lightly tap the axle inwards. So when you get the axle pushed in, it creates this large gap, large enough to get a 17mm socket and a ratchet back here to crack the 4 bolts back here free. You may want to turn the wheel left or right to gain further access, but there is plenty of room to get to all 4 bolts with the axle pushed in like this. The book requires you to actually take the spindle off, but I was able to do this without taking the whole spindle apart. Once you get the 4 bolts removed, you can go ahead and lightly tap the hub here with a hammer, and that'll vibrate the bearing out of the spindle here. And if it's really stuck, you may require you to spray it with like WD-40 or PB Blaster is what we use here at the shop. So when you're tapping the hub here with a hammer, you want to be prepared to catch it. It could come flying off. Once you get the hub and bearing loose enough, you can just pull it off like this and set it aside. Here is the replacement hub and bearing that I'm going to be using. I'll link this up in the description of the video. That way if you need to pick it up, you can find it there. Before I install the new bearing, I'm going to take a little sandpaper and scuff up the surface of the spindle here. That way if there's any surface rust, it knocks it off and the new bearing will fit flush onto the spindle here. And also I'll do the same thing here for the little backing plate. Once that's all cleaned up, I'll put the backing plate back on. When you install the backing plate, the little curved portion of it goes towards the spindle. So now you're going to line the bearing up with the 2 little notches up here facing upwards and the 1 notch facing straight down. Then you can slip the bearing over the axle shaft and slide it onto the spindle. Before I install the bolts, I put a little red thread locker on the bolts. This is like a glue to help prevent the bolts from vibrating loose and coming back out. I will put a link for the thread locker in the description of the video also. So now I just lined everything up, started the 4 bolts, and I ran them in with my Milwaukee M12 ratchet here. There's even enough room to get power tools in here. After running the bolts in until they're snug, I took a torque wrench, set it to 60 foot-pounds, and I torqued all 4 bolts to 60 foot-pounds. Now you can reinstall the ABS sensor here and tighten that bolt down. And I just tightened the bolt until it's snug and maybe a 1/4 turn more, and that's about it. Now you can start the axle nut, and I'm going to use my M12 here to run the axle nut down just until it's snug. And then I'm going to torque it here in a second, but first we're going to put the rotor back on. So you can slip the rotor on, then I used a lug nut to hold it in place. Then I took the caliper here and I slid the caliper back over the rotor. Put a little bit of thread locker on the bolts for the calipers. Then I lined up the calipers and started the bolts. I started them by hand, and then I used my impact gun here to run the bolts in and just snug them up. I'm going to use a torque wrench to actually torque the bolts down. So I set my torque wrench up to 150 foot-pounds, and I torqued the 2 bolts down to 150 foot-pounds. So now I'm going to go ahead and remove the lug nut that's holding the rotor on, slip the tire back on, and I'm going to run a couple of the lug nuts down, and then I'm going to lower the vehicle down till the tire's touching the ground. Then I'll torque the axle nut, And I'll torque that axle nut down to 147 foot-pounds. And once the axle nut is torqued, then I'll install a brand new cotter pin. After that, I'll lift the vehicle back up and remove the lug nuts here and install the hubcap. If yours uses mag wheels, then you can go ahead and install all your wheels, lug nuts, and torque the lug nuts. But mine had a hubcap, so I'm going to install the hubcap back on, install all the lug nuts back on. I'm going to run them down until they're snug, and then I'll torque these down to 83 foot-pounds using a torque wrench. So I will link up all the parts and tools that I use in this video in the description. That way, if you need to pick up any of those, you can find those there. And that will complete the job of replacing the front wheel bearings on a 2003 through 2009 Nissan Quest. I'm Brian Esser from How to Automotive. I'd like to thank you guys for watching my videos. Encourage you to subscribe. Invite you to head over to the howtoautomotive.com website for more valuable videos like this. And I'd like to thank you again for watching.